have to make a choice in terms of importance. You have to set your priorities and use your judgment in terms of what is the most important. All right? Yeah. So don't be compulsive about it. Because you're right, there are so many important points, you just have to make a selection. I also will have handouts, periodic handouts for you, and most of which I have generated because I think they are helpful teaching devices. With the help of my executive secretary, which I'm paying out of the horrendous amount of $1,000 which I got for that purpose. And so you will be getting periodically, and so far we haven't had enough money to really make enough copies, so we are running a little bit short, but I hope this will be remedied.
Today I have the pleasure and the honor of presenting Professor Daniel C. Matt, Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and Director of the Master of Arts program at the same university. It's in its Center for Jewish Studies. He received his Ph.D. from Brandeis University and has worked under Gershon Shalom and Alexander Altman. He has taught at Boston University and the University of Texas at Austin. His articles have appeared in various journals, including the Hebrew Union College Annual, The Reconstructionist, the magazine Fiction, and New Traditions. His edition of the Book of Mirrors by David Ben Hasid was published by Scholars Press in 1982. Zohar, the Book of Enlightenment, his volume of annotated poetic translations from the major work of Jewish mysticism, was published by the Paulist Press in their Classics of Western Spirituality, and this is the book. And it is available for you to look at and possibly to buy after the lecture. This book was published in 1984, won wide critical acclaim. His topic today is the roots of anti-Semitism. Would you please welcome Professor Matt?
Thank you. Unfortunately, the history of anti-Semitism is long and complex. I intend today simply to sketch its development from antiquity to the beginning of the 20th century. The term anti-Semitism was coined in the year 1879 by the German agitator and anti-Semite Wilhelm Marr, M-A-R-R. It soon came into general use to denote all forms of hostility toward the Jews. In antiquity, prejudice against Jews appeared almost exclusively in those countries which later became part of the Roman Empire. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that in the lands of the Babylonian exile, anti-Semitism did not exist. In the land of Israel in Hellenistic times, the Gentile population was concentrated in the coastal towns and in the Transjordan. The Jewish population engaged principally in agriculture. The non-Jewish population occupied itself primarily with commerce. These Gentiles were in close contact with the foreign powers in the region, and they were contemptuous of the Jewish population, whom they regarded as isolated people who avoided civilization and refrained from all contact with the outside world. The Gentiles knew that in the eyes of the Jews, pagan religion and pagan practice rendered the non-Jews unclean. Intermarriage was forbidden. As dietary laws, no real social interchange was possible. The first serious manifestation of anti-Semitism in history was the attack on the Jewish religion in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, approximately the years 175 to 164 before the Christian era. This is an attack that Jews recall each year at Hanukkah. As a Hellenistic ruler, Antiochus saw himself as a torchbearer of the ideals of Hellenism. The hostility of the Jews to every other religion was seen as an obstacle to the realization of the Hellenistic cultural mission. No other nation at the time denied the gods of its neighbors. On the contrary, it recognized them, identifying them with its own deities. This pan-religiosity was used with considerable success by the Hellenistic ruling authorities in order to create a social bond between the various people and their domains. None of the peoples refrained from dining at one table with their neighbors and from partaking sacrifices offered to their gods, except the Jews. None of the peoples refused to send gifts to its neighbors' temples, except the Jews. None of the peoples was unequivocally hostile to intermarriage, except the Jews. The Hellenistic rulers characterized these Jewish attitudes as misanthropy, a flagrant denial of the Hellenic principle of the unity of all humanity. The Jews defeated the forces of Antiochus as the Hasmonean kingdom, the Jewish Hasmonean kingdom, and established its dominion over the whole land of Israel. The Jewish Hasmonean kings occasionally adopted a policy of political and religious oppression vis-a-vis the inhabitants of the pagan cities of Palestine. Against this background, libels began to circulate, denying that the Jews had any right to remain in the land. Stories were told about a leprous or unclean people who had been banished from Egypt so that the land and its temples could be purified. These legends were now related to the biblical tale of the Exodus. The new version was that the Jews had been expelled from Egypt because of their uncleanliness, that they had continued to separate themselves from the other nations in the land of Israel, in Eretz Israel. With the consolidation of Roman rule in Palestine, fresh fuel for anti-Semitic excesses was provided by emperor worship. This worship assumed the form of a permanent political institution. It was not regarded as religious homage to the emperor, but simply as an expression of loyalty to the state, which was itself endowed with religious sanctity. The refusal of the Jews to accept the imperial cult was equated in the minds of many Romans with the refusal to recognize the authority of the state. As a result, the belief gradually began to take hold in the pagan world that the Jews had no respect for whatever was held in esteem by the rest of humanity. While in the diaspora, the Jews formed approximately 10 to 12% of the population of the Roman Empire. They were not, as a rule, restricted in regard to place of residence. There was no part of the empire where they were not to be found. Jews played an important role in the economic life of the countries in which they lived. They were unrestricted in their choice of occupation. In regard to their legal position, no discrimination was made between them and other citizens of the Roman Empire. Between the 1st century E and the 1st century CE, however, several factors brought about a radical change. In Egypt, strong opposition to Roman rule became manifest. The upper strata of Alexandrian Egyptians found themselves competing with the Jews for Roman favor. Judaism and Jews were increasingly described as flouting not only the law, but all of human society. Elements that had already appeared during the Hasmonean period were now arranged into a rationale of anti-Jewishness. Many Greek authors of the 1st century CE portray the Jewish people as descendants of a mob of lepers, a contaminated rabble whom the Egyptians had cast out. As unclean people who had been afflicted with leprosy, they shunned the flesh of swine, since this creature was especially prone to contract that disease. It was alleged that human beings were sacrificed in the temple in Jerusalem. The destruction of the temple in the year 70 was seen as evidence that the Jews were hated by God. I move now to a few comments on anti-Semitism in the New Testament. The anti-Semitism of the pagan world was not as fateful for the Jews as that which later crystallized within Christianity. With the political triumph of Christianity, the old pagan anti-Semitic image of the Jews as a people hated by God was resuscitated, but the reasons for God's hatred were changed to suit the new circumstances. The Jews were gradually excluded from every sphere of political influence, and their rights were increasingly denied. Jesus, of course, had no intention of founding a new religion. As Christianity developed, the church created a type of midrash, midrash meaning a homiletical interpretation or expansion of the biblical materials. This Christological midrash was an exegesis of portions of the Bible, especially Psalms and the prophets. Christianity argued that the true meaning of scriptures was the prophecy of Jesus as the Christ. Chapter 53 of Isaiah told of a rejected prophet whose suffering and death made atonement for Israel. Psalms, especially Psalms 18, 22, and 69, told of a king who was God's anointed, who was so overwhelmed by his enemies that his soul was sinking down to Sheol, down to the netherworld, but at the last moment God reached down into the lower darkness, drew him up from out of many waters, establishing him upon his holy mount, making him king over the whole earth. In Psalm 110, Christians found that this messianic king was to be reserved at God's right hand until God had defeated all his enemies. In the book of Daniel, they read of a glorious figure like the Son of Man who was to appear with God at the final judgment. In Zechariah, they found many significant passages, such as the one which said that on the day of God's victory, the people would, quote, look upon him whom they have pierced, unquote. Who were the enemies of the Messianic prophet? They must be the official leadership of Israel, the priests and the scribes. This official leadership could no longer be trusted to interpret the Bible correctly. Only the emerging church understood the real meaning of Scripture. And only those who believed in this Christological midrash would be included in the true remnant of Israel. All others would be cast aside. The rabbis had never heard anything about a dying Messiah. To them, the new Christological midrash seemed bizarre. There was an inevitable contradiction between this Christological midrash and the traditional midrash of the Pharisees. The church found it necessary to develop a collection of texts against the Jews to show why the authority of the official Jewish tradition should be discounted, why its midrash was woefully inadequate. So the other side of the Christological midrash was an anti-Judaic midrash. The church promoted the idea that the official Jewish leadership could not be trusted to interpret the Bible correctly. An extreme formulation can be found in the speech of Stephen in the opening chapters of Acts. Here it is said, that which is called Israel had in fact never been the true people of Israel. Israel had been so disobedient that God withheld the covenant from them and reserved it for those who accepted Jesus as Christ. The Pharisees, of course, appear in an extremely negative light in the New Testament. Now, there were examples of hypocrisy among the Pharisees, no doubt. The Talmud itself, the main book of Jewish tradition, criticizes some of its own fellow Pharisees, poking fun at the shoulder Pharisee, who wears his good deeds on his shoulder, the bruised Pharisee, who knocks his head on a wall to avoid looking at a woman, the bookkeeping Pharisee, who calculates his good deeds. A Pharisee who serves God out of love, states the Talmud, is a true Pharisee. But the New Testament teaches that the Pharisees as a group represented mere legalism, formalism, and hypocrisy. Christianity, on the other hand, is characterized by genuine devotion, belief, and spirituality. Actually, the Pharisees themselves were creating a religious revolution, spiritualizing and democratizing Judaism, replacing the hierarchy of the priests with a broad-based leadership of rabbis and synagogues. They were more conservative than the Christians, but no less sincere. Yet to the church, the Pharisees' teaching, their interpretation of God's word, was the main competition and threat. Beware the leaven of the Pharisees was the watchword of the church, meaning beware the Pharisaic midrash, their interpretation of the Bible. The new Christological midrash taught a new principle of salvation, pertained to a new people of God. Christianity and the Jewish religious tradition were incompatible. Everywhere that the church preached the gospel, in Jerusalem and in the diaspora, it found itself expelled from the Jewish religious institutions. Some Jews converted, to be sure, but the representatives of the normative religious tradition shut the synagogue doors against Christian preachers. The deep hostility to the Pharisees in the synoptic tradition reflects this evangelical experience. The Christians were unable to convert the core of God, yet unexpectedly, Gentiles were attracted to Christianity and began to come in great numbers. Rejected by Judaism, the church found its fertile missionary field among the Gentiles. Now the Christological Midrash was expanded to include the idea that God was carving out for himself a new people from among the Gentiles. The Jews who adhere to the old, outmoded covenant, the Old Testament, have rejected the gospel. So God has rejected a true people of God as being gathered from among the Gentiles in antithetical relation to an apostate Israel. As Paul and Barnabas say to the Jews in Acts chapter 13, quote, "Since you thrust the word of God from you and judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life, behold, we turn to the Gentiles." Unquote. The term the Jews is used as a hostile formula frequently in Acts and John. The term refers to the Jewish religious community. Jews now is a symbol of all that resists and rejects the gospel. Thus, the anti-Judaic tradition in Christianity grew as a negative expression of the need of the church to legitimate its Christological midrash. The church insisted that only this midrash represents the true meaning of the Hebrew Bible. Until Jewish religious tradition accepts this as the real meaning of the Torah, the Jews were to be kept in the status of the enemies of God. Of the Gospels, the last logically, namely Matthew and John, are the most hostile to Judaism. These Gospels already contain the two cardinal themes of medieval Christian anti-Semitism. In Matthew chapter 27, verse 25, the Jews themselves are made to admit their collective responsibility for the crucifixion. Quote, "Then all the people answered and said, 'His blood be on us and on our children.'" Unquote. In John chapter 8, the Jews are identified with the powers of evil. "You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires." Unquote. The evolution of Christian anti-Semitism reflects the spread of the new faith among pagan circles and a progressive withdrawal from Judaism. The Gospel's description of the crucifixion thus minimizes the role of Pilate, Pontius Pilate, out of a desire to gain the goodwill of the Roman authorities. The destruction of the temple in the year 70 again provided evidence of the divine chastisement against the people. The anti-Jewish theories developed by the Church Fathers are variations or extensions of these first accusations leveled in the Gospels. They're developed with particular vehemence by the Greek Fathers, who exercised their apostolic authority in regions where the Jewish population was large and influential. Among some of the early bishops, Judeophobia was on the same scale as religious fervor. To Gregory of Nyssa and John Chrysostom, love of Jesus and hatred of presumed executioners were indistinguishable. After Christianity became the official religion of the Roman state in the year 321, the emperors began to translate the concepts and claims of the theologians into practice. The ancient privileges granted to the Jews by the Roman Empire were withdrawn. Rabbinical jurisdiction was abolished or curtailed, and proselytism was prohibited and made punishable by death, as were relations with Christian women. Finally, Jews were excluded from holding high office or pursuing a military career. The rapid disintegration of the Roman Empire in the 5th century postponed the effects of these restrictions. Only centuries later, in the Middle Ages, did they serve as the model for legislation. But Judaism did not cease to exist, and this was somewhat of an embarrassment to the Church, which saw itself as Verus Israel, the true Israel. Great theologians such as Augustine now began to adopt the doctrine that represents the Jews as the witness to the truth of Christianity. Jewish existence was justified by their humiliation as the church triumphed over the synagogue. The Jews are condemned to perpetual servitude. A further variation, reversing the biblical image, depicts the Jews as Esau and the Christians as Jacob. The ideological arsenal of Christian anti-Semitism was by now well established. And now to the Middle Ages. Jews had appeared in Western Europe from the beginning of the Christian era. We know from some of the clerical, polemical writings that Jews did exert some influence on the general Christian population. For example, the 9th century Christian artist Agobard writes as follows, quote, "Things have reached a stage where ignorant Christians claim that the Jews preach better than our priests. Some Christians even celebrate the Sabbath with the Jews and violate the holy repose of Sunday. Men of the people, peasants, allow themselves to be plunged into such a sea of errors that they regard the Jews as the only people of God, and consider that the Jews combine the observance of a pure religion and a truer faith than ours." Quote. Church councils continually legislated to prevent these contacts. Some persecutions and expulsions occurred at the beginning of the 11th century, but the crucial event was the First Crusade in the year 1096. Religious excitation commingled with greed for gain. As bands of crusaders set out to recapture the sepulchre of Jesus, they were prompted to wreak vengeance on Jesus' legendary enemies, and they attacked Jewish quarters in Jewish towns along the way. These massacres, perpetrated during the summer of 1096 especially, made a lasting impression upon both Christians and Jews. There were collective suicides on the part of Jews to avoid forced conversion. These acts of martyrdom became known as Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying the name of God. European economic life began to revive in the 12th century. Christian guilds did not admit Jews, but the economic resurgence is credit operations, and here the Jews were to play a fateful role. The church regarded the practice of usury as endangering the eternal salvation of its flock, and it opposed the overt practice of money lending. However, in contemporary economic conditions, such lending was inevitable, and the church subsequently endorsed money lending by the Jews, for according to the prevalent opinion, their souls were lost in any case. The doctrine and practice, which thus spread, constituted a major source of anti-Semitism. The Jew, already stigmatized as an infidel and deicide, one who had killed God, was now regarded as the direct antagonist of the Christian, and thus began to symbolize the hostile stranger par excellence. Each renewed preaching for the Crusades roused anti-Jewish excesses, despite the protection afforded by the ecclesiastical and lay authorities. Religious consciousness among the masses intensified. The Jews' role of the scapegoat of Christianity. Rumors were spread about Jewish desecration of the consecrated host, of the blood libel, the fantastic notion that Jews required Christian blood as part of their ritual activity. The Fourth Lateran Council of the Church in the year 1215 promulgated a canon requiring the Jews to wear a distinguishing mark. This decision was intended to make any intimate relations between Jews and Christians impossible. The former was not specified. In practice, the Jews in Latin countries were made to adopt a disc sewn onto their clothing. In Germanic countries, a distinctive hat. Contemporary iconography, Christian art, also depicts the biblical patriarchs themselves, as well as Christian heretics of all kinds, in this dress. Jews were also depicted with a tail and horns, the attributes of the devil. During the 13th century, the economic position of the Jews, consequently the protection from which they benefited, was impaired by the development of finance on an international scale in Italy and France. The kings of England, for example, found that they could now dispense with the services of the Jews, and they were expelled from England in the year 1290. In 1306, the first general expulsion from France took place. Expulsions and massacres also followed in the German towns. These mass expulsions helped to perpetuate the image of Jewish homelessness, of the wandering Jew, to roam from country to country. At the beginning of the 14th century, the specter of a conspiracy against Christianity found new expression in the popular belief that the wells were being poisoned by the Jews. The church combated these myths of popular demonology, but at the same time, the clerical anti-Jewish tradition added fuel to the fire. For example, passion plays, reenacting the crucifixion, took place annually. These usually lasted several days, and highlighted cruelty and perfidy of the Jewish executioners. Often the established lay and ecclesiastical authorities protected the Jews. The adversaries of the Jews were recruited from among the rising middle class and among the mendicant Franciscan and Dominican orders. In Spain, the slow pace of the Christian reconquest enabled the Jews to continue to benefit from a privileged situation. The conceptions current in the rest of Europe took time to spread to the Iberian Peninsula. It was not until the end of the century that bloody persecution began in Spain. In 1492, the Jews were expelled after a preliminary blood libel and trial had been staged. In general, popular susceptibility to anti-Semitism developed in the Middle Ages. It was perpetuated by religious instruction. The catechism, practically the only form of popular education for hundreds of years, instilled the souls of children with hostility against the executioners of Christ. As Erasmus writes, ironically, at the beginning of the 16th century, if it is incumbent upon a good Christian to detest the Jews, then we are all good Christians. We move now toward modern times, the Reformation. The Reformation had important, complex, and even contradictory repercussions on the evolution of anti-Semitism. One branch of Protestantism, Calvinism, proved less Judeo-phobic than Catholicism until the 20th century. The other branch, Lutheranism, became increasingly anti-Semitic. It is difficult to fully explain this, but from the outset, Calvinism emphasized individual responsibility, embracing social values and moral action. To Lutheranism, on the other hand, justification by faith implied a renunciation of civic responsibility and hostility to active faith, or salvation by works, which Luther himself describes as jüdische Glaube, Jewish. At the end of his life, Luther vilified the Jews in violent pamphlets that had wide influence. Conversely, the role played by the Old Testament in Calvinism led the Puritan sects to identify themselves with the Jews of the Bible and to shed hostility toward contemporary Jewry. In regions of Europe which remained Catholic, the position of the Jews was aggravated. The popes of the Counter-Reformation were determined to apply canon law strictly. One result was that from the 16th century, ghettos were introduced, first in Italy, then in the Austrian Empire. This segregation served as a convenient demonstration of the error of Judaism. As one 18th century Catholic publicist wrote, quote, "A Jewish ghetto is a better proof of the truth of the religion of Jesus Christ than a whole school of theologians," unquote. Meanwhile, Jews began to settle freely in the Low Countries, in Great Britain and its colonies, in particular in North America. The Enlightenment. As long as Christianity held unchallenged sway in Europe, Jews could exist only on the margin of European social life. With the coming of the 18th century Enlightenment, however, their isolation slowly began to crumble. A new class of bourgeois intellectuals, the philosophes, denounced Christianity in the name of deism, or natural religion, and ushered in the secularism of the modern era. For the first time in centuries, the status of the Jew became a matter for widespread debate. Many of the philosophes found it only natural to sympathize with the Jews. Not only were the Jews the oppressed people par excellence, in a century that prided itself on the concern for justice, but they were also the most notorious victims of Christian intolerance, which the Enlightenment was sworn to destroy. Accordingly, protests against the persecution of the Jews becomes one of the standard pieces of 18th century rhetoric. Led by Montesquieu, Lessing, and Enlightenment writers everywhere preached that Christian and Jew shared a common humanity and common human rights. As early as 1714, the English freethinker John Toland proposed emancipation of the Jews. When at last the Jews of France were emancipated in 1791, it was largely the authority of the Enlightenment that overcame objections of churchmen and Gentile economic interests. Despite its achievements, however, the Enlightenment's pro-Jewish agitation was not purely humanitarian. When the Enlightenment chose to defend the Jews, it did so largely for reasons of its own. It sought not to comfort the Jews, but to exploit their plight for the purpose of condemning Christianity. admiring accounts of the Jewish religion were also intended to discredit Christianity. The Enlightenment dealt with not as real individuals, but as a useful abstraction. Actual Jews were usually regarded with suspicion and distaste. To the Enlightenment, Judaism was a religion much like Christianity, and hence a superstition to be eradicated. Judaism was considered antisocial, nurturing a stubborn sense of particularism, creating grave divisions within the state. Indeed, the most common argument for emancipation was precisely that it would convert the Jews to the majority culture, lessening their most obnoxious traits. This view was ultimately upheld by the French revolutionaries, who declared in 1791, quote, "To the man, everything, to the Jew, nothing," unquote. As a citizen, the Jew was to receive full rights. As a Jew, he was to count for nothing. In fact, for all their resistance to racism, some of the leaders of the Enlightenment played a central role in the development of anti-Semitic ideology. The emancipation, reaction against it. In the 19th century, the question of the alien nature of the Jew reappeared as a central issue. It eventually became clear that anti-Semitism was at its root a form of xenophobia, hatred of the stranger. The end of the medieval era of faith in politics did not mean the end of anti-Semitism. As a result of the French and the American revolutions, there were two states in the world at the beginning of the 19th century, which were now equal citizens before the law. Between 1790 and 1815, the armies of France appeared throughout Europe, not as conquerors, but as liberators of the peoples from the yoke of their existing governments. Wherever the revolution spread, its legislation included equality for the Jews. In the wake of Napoleon's defeat, the emancipation remained on the books in France, but it was generally removed elsewhere. The battle for Jewish equality had to begin again. It became a century-long battle in Europe to achieve the liberal revolution everywhere. The most important battleground was in Germany. Capitalism was rapidly remaking the social structure, and the victims of the rising capitalist order, especially the lower middle classes, found their scapegoat in the most vulnerable group among the successful, namely the Jews. Some thinkers, such as Karl Marx and Werner Sombart, identified Jews with the spirit of capitalism. For anti-Semites of the right and the left, who hated capitalism for different reasons, such identification was one of the sources and rationales of Jew hatred into the modern era, into the Nazi period. Hatred rooted in class conflict, combined with anger derived from nationalism, to produce the most violent and murderous attack on Jews in all history. The rising Romanticism in Germany and the nationalist reactions to the Napoleonic Wars engendered the view that the true German spirit, organic and lasting identity, in which the Jew could not, by his very nature, participate. Jews were seen as a non-Aryan, Oriental element, whose very nature was of a different modality. Germany itself remained politically undivided until 1870, and the very difficulties in realizing the unity of the country brought the existence of Jews into unfriendly focus. In the last quarter of the 19th century, anti-Semitism became an acceptable element in German political life, manipulated by leaders seeking popular, lower middle-class support. Anti-Semitism was growing throughout Europe and in Tsarist Russia. In Vienna, the 1890s were marked by repeated re-election as mayor of Karl Lueger on an avowedly anti-Semitic platform. Lueger appealed to the impoverished lower middle classes, who envied the success of the Jews in Vienna's economic and cultural life. The emperor, to his credit, refused to confirm Lueger's first four elections. On the fifth such occasion, in 1897, he finally gave in. It was Lueger to whom the very young Adolf Hitler listened when he came to Vienna to try to become a painter. The first international meeting of all the anti-Semitic parties took place in 1882. By 1900, anti-Semitism was clearly an international movement. By 1900 also, the Jewish masses on the move had already made a crucial decision that the future was to be found in the United States. The ideologists and earliest pioneers of Zionism had moved eastward, out of the European arena, to to the creation of a renewed Jewish national identity in Eretz Israel. The outbreak of anti-Semitism in the Nazi era culminated in the Holocaust of most of European Jewry. Nazism succeeded in the backwash of the German defeat in World War I, the creation of the Weimar Republic, and the subsequent economic disaster. Jews were very in the founding of Weimar and in the anti-traditional culture of the Weimar period. They were thus identified with the most un-German era of modern German history. This was the situation within which Nazism appealed, especially to the petty bourgeoisie, who envied the seemingly ever more successful Jews. But the question of what were the ultimate roots and sources of the Nazi horrors remains a matter of controversy. The most debatable question is whether it was a demonic aberration in which the underside of human nature broke all the bonds of civilization, or whether Nazism arose from a joining together of all the forms of modern anti-Semitism in an outbreak armed with the most advanced technical tools of mass murder. Once we have surveyed this whole history of anti-Semitism, the demonic element in Nazism does not seem so unprecedented. Its appearance is related to a long past, for which Western history cannot disclaim moral responsibility. In closing, the existence of Jews, the Jewish community, Judaism, and Jewish identity as a people apart inevitably carries with it the prospect of that attack upon them which is termed anti-Semitism. The hatred of the unlike is an all-too-human phenomenon. Add to it dimensions of supposedly demonic powers, of many centuries of damnation of Jews by Christianity as the enemies of God, of the need for oaths in times of turmoil and defeat, and there then appears anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the most lasting expression in Western history of the hatred of one who is regarded as alien. If that alien maintains, or once maintained, or is believed to have maintained his own religious or cultural superiority, then the great hatred arises. Anti-Semitism has been less fashionable after the horror of Hitler, but it would be too hopeful to believe that its day is over. Thank you. I'd be happy to take a few questions. I realize we ran through quite a lot very quickly, and we have some time. Yes?
Didn't the Edit de Nantes, which was given by Henry IV of France, give the Jews any equality of freedom?
I don't know. The question is whether Jews had protection or equality from, let's say, from various kings. In general, the Jews were felt to be the property of the king in the Middle Ages. And this worked to their benefit and against their cause. On the one hand, they were protected, and you often have situations where there'll be a local uprising or a popular anti-Semitic mob, and the king will protect the Jews within the castle, or, with his own forces. On the other hand, he felt free to plunder the Jews, to hold them for ransom. Certain situations, all the Jews would be gathered together. Really, what sometimes happened is Jews would be in synagogue on Sabbath morning, on Saturday morning, and the rulers would come and just close the synagogue doors and say, we won't let anyone out until a certain amount of gold is paid. So the Jews did receive some protection and certain rights because of royal ownership, but they were vulnerable at the same time. Yes?
I'm curious about one historical phenomenon that you referred to, the expulsion from France, England, and Germany, and presumably other European countries or areas in the late Middle Ages of Jews. If those expulsions, well, maybe you could comment a little more on the actual mechanics of those expulsions, because it appears to me that if they were indeed expelled from those countries, then why were there any Jews left for the Kalmars to set up ghettos with?
Right. How could there be anti-Semitism? Right. The Jews were not, first of all, many of the expulsions were temporary. Spain was more or less a permanent expulsion. The Jews who were expelled from Spain in the year 1492, there were Jews who had converted to Christianity who secretly still practiced Judaism, the followers of the conversos, as they're known, or the Marranos. And we know there was secret practice of Judaism in Spain throughout those intervening in general, a overt professing Jew could not be found in Spain from the year 1500, let's say, until the 20th century. I think it was 1912. The Jews were found out back in Spain. So in Spain, it really is a total lapse, total absence. In much of Europe, they were temporary expulsions, although they could be decades or hundreds of years. In England, I believe the expulsion lasted pretty much until the 16th century. So that's really from let's say 12, until 1500.
Were the expelled Jews always able to find other havens that they could retreat to for these periods until they were allowed back to their home country?
At some points, I mean, really, the Jews begin to move toward Eastern Europe as a result of expulsions, and Jews moved to North Africa, to the Ottoman Empire. After the expulsion from Spain was the most drastic and sudden, really unexpected. It was almost on the level of the Holocaust, certainly not in terms of loss of life at all, but in terms of a shock to the Jewish world. It was the richest, both culturally and financially, the richest Jewish community, and the Jews being expelled in 1492 in one fell swoop really devastated the Jewish consciousness. But Jews moved from there both to the New World and to North Africa, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, and indirectly into Eastern Europe. But I would say, your question is really a good one. For parts of, certainly for parts of Germany and France, Jews could be expelled from one territory and find haven in another city. So it was more the homelessness or rootlessness that was perpetrated, rather than a total lack of available. Yes.
I'm curious, this concept of the Jew as the other, that in one sense, you want to be an other to be, that we have a national and an identity of some sort. The other one, because if you lose that otherness, then you become assimilated and you disappear. But if you keep that otherness, then you're open to being the scapegoat. How can that be dealt with in the...
Questions are getting harder.
I'd like to answer that question.
Oh, great. How do we solve that problem?
Herzl answered that question in 1896 with his theories on the Jewish state. That was it. It was the exact same question. He began to think, if things go on, another enlightenment comes, and Jews are accepted, assimilation, and his definition of assimilation was for us to disappear into the population, where the Jews would become part and parcel of the culture. The only way to maintain this and to be accepted by the world community as a whole was for the Jews to have the Jewish state. And that was the great motivation for the World Zionist movement that started in 1896 and has culminated in the State of Israel.
Certainly, I think a lot of what you say is helpful. Certainly modern Zionism is a response to anti-Semitism in Europe. In fact, something I skipped over was that Herzl actually, partly motivated by this election of Karl Lueger over and over in Vienna, and by the Dreyfus affair, which many of you may know about, the Jewish general who was charged falsely in France at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And Herzl concluded that the Jews cannot be fully accepted, despite the minor successes of emancipation, Enlightenment emancipation. There's no way out except for a Jewish state. Now, obviously, not all Jews have moved to Israel. It's very unlikely that all Jews will, and it's very unlikely that all the committed Jews will move to Israel and all the non-committed Jews will stay in the diaspora. There is a vibrant Jewish community, certainly in America and in various other countries in Europe and in South America, in Russia. And that's obviously a unique case. So the question really remains, how do you maintain a positive Jewish identity outside of the land of Israel and at the same time not be asking for persecution? Anti-Semitism, despite minor exceptions, has not played a role in American Jewish history. Now, there are people who track this very carefully, and the reports now that last year the anti-Semitic instances were on the rise. But certainly in general, the Jews have integrated themselves well into American society. Some people would say too well, that if you become too well integrated, you become assimilated, and that's why you have phenomena such as the Hasidim, who insist on standing up against all possible assimilation. I don't really have an answer for that. I think one has to search one's tradition and celebrate one's, but try to expand the ethical truths of Judaism, try to see love of neighbor as extending to humanity. Certainly that is the motivation, the original motivation of Paul, perhaps of Jesus himself, and certainly of Paul, to bring the treasures of the Jewish tradition to the non-Jewish world. Now, Jews who have remained Jews and not converted to Christianity, still, I think it's incumbent upon us to expand Jewish teaching, to not to become ourselves fearful of the enemy. Yes?
I don't know how to ask this, but I don't understand why Judaism doesn't allow itself to grow and take in. I know a lot of people don't like when I bring up this question, but I just find like there was a poem. Somebody said, "How come we are so smart and yet so dumb that we see the markings on the wall? What happens? We refuse to do anything."
To do what, for example?
Well, to allow Judaism to grow and to allow people to adopt Judaism. We make it very, very difficult, and we turn away a lot.
You mean in terms of conversion or proselytism?
Yes, because there were times in Jewish history when whole cities converted to Judaism because they found it a much richer, a more humane, or whatever.
Right. I would say really for the first few centuries of the Christian movement, of Christianity, Jews and Christians, certainly the first century, Jews and Christians are competing for converts. It's really the situation you have in the Near East. That people in the Mediterranean world were very attracted to teachings of the Torah. So obviously teachings such as Shabbat. The Sabbath is a very appealing doctrine, very humanitarian and very beautiful, very pleasant. Many of the ethical teachings of Judaism were appealing to the Gentile world. And the church and the synagogue were really competing for this. Once Paul makes the decision, the tactical decision you could say, not to require circumcision and not to require dietary laws, and eventually not to require any of the ritual laws for conversion, Christianity wins the game. It's really, in other words, one can have all the ethical beauty of Judaism and the Sabbath in a slightly revised form without bearing one's foreskin, without, if one is a male, without many of the detailed technical obligations of the mitzvot. So at that point, Christianity becomes more appealing. It's really the church that finally forbids Jews to compete for converts once the Roman Empire becomes Christian. But Judaism is not opposed to conversion. It's traditional that if someone comes to a rabbi to convert, the rabbi is supposed to say, well, do you know what you're getting yourself into? And that means not only do you know the obligations, do you know what it means to declare yourself as a Jew? A convert really has to study not only Jewish law, but Jewish history, and to realize of persecution, what that means to proclaim oneself to be Jewish. But if someone is sincere and wants to convert, that person is welcomed into the community. It's considered sinful to tell the person, well, you're really not 100% Jewish, or you weren't Jewish when you were born. That's forbidden according to Jewish law. So I don't think that's really an accurate perception. Obviously, there is a certain degree of cliquishness, I think, in any group, and Jews are prone to that. But, one has to get into that and work to improve things. In general, I think Judaism is welcoming to that. Yes?
I wonder if you would elaborate a little on the anti-Semitism of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the Christian.
Right. I really, because of the lack of time, I focus totally on Europe, Italy, and Roman Empire and Christianity, partly because that's more relevant for the theme of this course. There were manifestations of anti-Semitism in Islam, although that's really a misnomer. One can't really say that anti-Semitism means really being against Semites, so that would mean being against Muslims as well. But let's say, as the term is used, and I mentioned it really didn't emerge until the 19th century, 1879, I think it is, the term anti-Semitism. So is there anti-Semitism in the Islamic world? Obviously today one could know. Historically, the Jews really had it better in Islamic countries than in Christian countries. Jews and Christians were tolerated by Islam. Both are called peoples of the book, namely that they subscribe to the holy writings, since Islam recognizes Moses and Jesus as prophets, not as the ultimate prophet. Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, the final prophets. But Moses and Jesus are very highly regarded in Islam, and therefore Judaism are respected. It depended on which branch of Islam was in power. Sometimes under Shiites, for example, the more extreme, fanatical Islamic rulers. There's certain Shiite governments, Jews did have it bad. And the Almohads, they were an Islamic fundamentalist group who controlled North Africa and made certain raids into Spain. They lashed out against the Jews. But himself hoped that the Jews would see his message, as Luther hoped that the Jews would see his message. Luther felt he was rebelling against the church, and that it made perfect sense for the Jews to join with him. When the Jews didn't come out warmly, Luther really turned against them. Muhammad obviously drew on Jewish teachings. There are elements of Midrash and Talmudic learning in the Quran and in Islamic teaching. So, on one foot, as they say, al-regal afat, I would say, in general, there's much Semitism in Islamic countries, at least until relatively modern times. Yes?
Good. I'm glad he asked that before me, because I was going to ask you to speak to anti-Semitism in the non-Christian and non-Muslim, for example, in Asia.
Yeah, recently, especially this year, the last year or so, there are stories of rising anti-Semitism in Japan, for example, and one of the great horrible classics of anti-Semitic literature, the Protocols of the Elders, which was spread very widely in Russia in the 19th century, a text which claims that Jews are really I shouldn't use this word, a cabal, because I teach Kabbalah, and I think Kabbalah is a positive term, but a secret group of Jews, international conspiracy of Jews who want to take over the world, the banking world, the press, claiming that the Jews have regular meetings and are planning to take over the world. That fabrication, which was spread by Henry Ford in this country and by Russian authorities, by the Tsarist authorities, has appeared in various forms in Japanese translation, and there's a lot of rising anti-Semitism in Japan, perhaps because the Japanese economy has peaked and people are scared and looking for scapegoat. So for some of the same reasons that have happened in Europe, you can find it elsewhere. I'm not aware of huge amounts of anti-Semitism outside of Western countries, with that in mind. But you might correct me on that or add to that, and certainly I'm not claiming that it's only a potential problem. The Jews could be seen as alien, obviously, anywhere, perhaps even more alien outside of the West. But there are very few Jews now living in Asian countries in general, except for Israel. Yes?
I feel terribly ignorant, but I don't understand a lot of the religious terms you're using,
Sorry.
such as Semite. I don't know what that means. I've heard corrections, but I don't know what that means. I also don't really think I know the meaning of the word Gentile. Also, you used the word Midrash.
Midrash I did define very briefly. I don't know if you were here right at the beginning, but Midrash means literally searching, but it means interpretation of the Bible. So it's really taking a biblical story and expanding it, trying to fill in the gaps in the biblical story. For example, we hear in the Bible that Abraham was commanded to sacrifice Isaac. The Midrash tries to answer, well, what did they say as they were walking on the way? What were Isaac's concerns? What was Abraham's compassion? So filling in the details of the biblical account of the Midrash. A Gentile is simply someone who's not Jewish. A Semite term can be used differently. Obviously, the root comes from one of Noah's sons. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yefet. And in modern usage, I guess Semite refers to Jews and Arabs. Jews and Arabs are the main components of the Semitic faction.
What about
Pharisee is a controversial term. The reason it came up in this talk was because of the portrayal of the Pharisees in the New Testament. The Pharisees were a group of Jews, a group that probably arose around the 2nd century BCE. And say modern Judaism, or all of what's called rabbinic Judaism, is a creation of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the people really who developed the Midrash. The Pharisees said, we're not satisfied with the biblical laws as they stand. How can they be applied to modern times? For example, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. The Pharisees said, we can't believe that God really intended people to act in such a vicious manner, so they reinterpreted that rule, that piece of legislation, to mean monetary compensation. If by accident you take out my eye, I don't have a right to gouge out your eye. I have to pay for not only medical bills, but time you might have lost working, the shame you might have for wearing a bandage or being disfigured. So that type of humanization or expansion of the biblical law was the main item on the agenda of the Pharisees. In the New Testament, the Pharisees are really the competition, because Judaism, you could say, branches into two manifestations. One is Pharisaic Judaism, one is Christianity. Both of those grow out of 1st century Judaism, and both claim to be the true Judaism, or the true Israel. And that's why the Pharisees are so open to attack in the New Testament, and why the Pharisees would be so bitter against this Christian Messianic movement. Write me a letter with other questions. Yes?
I think historically anti-Semitism has been associated with poor, uneducated masses. Why would you suggest there is an appeal for anti-Semitism to upwardly mobile, highly educated blacks?
Today. Black-Jewish relations, of course, have a long history. The blacks identified with Israel to a certain extent, and a lot of the gospel singing, a lot of the hopes for redemption during the horrible decades slavery drew on Jewish sources, biblical sources. Blacks see themselves as Israel, about to be redeemed from the Pharaoh. Then, of course, the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, Jews were very prominent in that. And one theory is that blacks resented the role which Jews played, as if to say, we want to free ourselves. Now it looks like the Jews are helping us be freed. And there may have been some resentment against Jews for playing such an overt liberal role in the 60s. On the other, Jews living in the same city areas, in the same ghettos as the blacks lived in. And Jews, you could say, moved out of the cities more gradually, so that you had blacks growing up in the cities and many Jews still in the cities. The Jews reaching a certain level of prosperity and being in control of some of the neighborhoods where blacks lived. So the white with whom the black came in contact was often a Jewish white. That has to be part of the picture. And some of the Christian roots of anti-Semitism can be found in baptism and black churches as well. So some of the same factors and some unique factors. Would you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to add that in modern thinking, there's a whole effect of the Rastafarian movement, the Back to Africa movement, Marcus Garvey and the Rastafarians of Jamaica, on modern American black thinking. And the Rastafarians are a rejection of Christianity and a labeling of themselves as true. And all the white Jews are the pretenders who are taking their place in history when they, the black Rastafarians, are the true Jews that the Bible writes of. So that's influencing them.
One other thing I'd say more generally about theories of anti-Semitism, I didn't get into at all the psychological theories of anti-Semitism. Some of them are fascinating. But one that I came across a few years ago, I think there's something to it, although it'll sound a little bizarre to you perhaps, is that picture the typical Christian peasant, and I use that term neutrally, typical Christian lower middle class person in Europe having, let's say, this burden of Christianity. Christianity, to a certain extent, is an imposition of Judaism onto native European culture, the pre-Christian European culture. And you could say that resentment against Christianity, or resentment against the church, or let's even say resentment against Jesus, could not be spoken openly. And one way to get at that resentment against Christianity is to come out against the people who really gave us Christianity to begin with, namely the Jews. It sounds a little wild, but I think there's something to not being able to come out and criticize the church, and yet here in our midst are the people who gave us the church. Maybe against their will, but who gave it to us. Robert, do you have a comment?
I was going to ask you to elaborate just a little bit. In the Holocaust, a great many of the Jews who were slaughtered were Eastern European Jews, and you didn't deal with that part at all.
Right. I really left Russia out of the picture a little just because there was some other. And you can say Poland or Russia as to where Jews settled. There was very rabid anti-Semitism on the part of the Russian powers. And in some ways you could say that the Tsars used anti-Semitism to deflect any possible criticism of their own rule. That was a use of anti-Semitism throughout history, but it's especially true in 19th century Russia, where the Tsars are fomenting accounts of the blood libel or host desecration in the Russian Orthodox Church in order to get the peasants off their backs or to identify an enemy. So that's one element of it. Obviously, Russian anti-Semitism is still around. Jews who participated actively in the revolutionary movements, even though obviously once that revolution was successful, that worked well for the Jews for a certain amount of time. Horrible pogroms toward the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, and huge numbers of East European Jews who came to America as a result of that persecution. Poland is really gradually being carved up by various European powers. Many of the Jews who lived in Poland suffered from that persecution. There's one red letter dated Jewish history, 1648, which had been was predicted to be a year of messianic deliverance, actually, in certain Jewish and Christian communities, but it turned into a year of massacres because of a peasant uprising, an uprising led by Khmelnytsky, who was rebelling against the overlords, really the Polish overlords, but in rebelling against them also lashed out at the Jewish middlemen, the Jews who were being employed by the Poles to collect taxes, to run their inns or small farms. So again, you have the situation where a revolt against the ruling classes at the same time lashes out at the people being used by the ruling classes, in this case the Jews. So I'll just get by with mentioning those two details. Yes?
I would agree with you and concur that the New Testament is inherently anti-Judaic.
I didn't put it that way. I don't
well,
know.
I am. And I need to take it from there. But and given the fact that it continues to be the central text, sacred text of all of Christianity, translated into meaningful languages and circulated through all sects, then what can you see about the possibility in the future, about either the possibilities or limitations of what's called the Jewish-Christian dialogue?
Right, that's a very good question. I think maybe we'll end with that, and then I'll be happy to talk informally with people afterward. I teach at a school where Jews and Buddhists study together, and it's very important for my own work. I would say that Jews and Christians really need to come to an appreciation of each other's tradition. First, obviously to identify the negative elements, but for Jews and Christians to take it upon themselves to cultivate some appreciation of the other. And I would mention just a couple specifics. I think Jews should come to see Jesus as a Jewish teacher, not as the Messiah, not as the greatest, as a Jewish teacher, as a rabbi. That word rabbi is used very informally in the first century. There is no formal ordination. And Jesus' teaching is very much in line with Jewish ethics. At certain points, he radicalizes Jewish ethics and demands more. He can also be very close-minded in his own way. And Jesus obviously saw it as his mission to reach the Jews. Jesus had no interest in speaking to a non-Jewish audience. Now, there are people who disagree with that, and you can find different statements on the New Testament. If you do a careful study of the New Testament, it's pretty clear that Jesus' main or almost total interest is simply to speak to the Jews. And I think Jews aren't going to lose anything by listening to what Jesus has to say, not the claims of being God. We don't know whether Jesus really claimed to be divine. We don't know even if he claimed to be the Messiah. That's really a matter for scholarly dispute. But I mean Jesus' ethical teachings as a source of Jewish learning. Christianity really has succeeded in spreading Jewish teaching to the world in, you could say, a diluted form, in a corrupted form, in a different form, in a unique form. I would use all those words to describe different facets of Christianity as related to Judaism. But the Bible is read in all these languages, not only the New Testament, but the Hebrew Bible, because of Christianity. You don't find rabbis in Jerusalem translating the Bible into Korean, but you do find Christian church devoting itself to that. What did Christians have to learn from Judaism? That's a little harder for me to say. Christian theologians have talked about that now also. But I would say most simply to appreciate Midrash, or to come back to this term. In other words, not to assume that Jewish learning ends with the Book of Chronicles. The last book of the Hebrew Bible is not the last Jewish text which should interest the Christian. A Christian should be interested in the expansion of the Hebrew Bible in the Midrash, what's called the oral Torah, and really to even use that as a resource in preaching in the church, I think. Yes?
Came to visit San Francisco some time ago, and then many of us went demonstrating. My objection and why I went to demonstrate was because of the building of Christian institutions on concentration camps in which just Jews were slaughtered. Now, what kind of a statement is that by the Catholic institution about Judaism and about the Holocaust? What is the...
That build a convent at the site of Auschwitz has now been rescinded. And obviously the problem or some of the problems could arise again. And, wall time is still in the news. I don't really have an answer for that, but I think what we need to do is to be honest about the tensions and to try to appreciate the positive points within the tradition. Let me stop there and we'll be happy. So,
this is an A-related question because you may not be actually the right person to address this question to. It seems to me that there's certainly, at least in Western countries, a lot of people, Jewish and Christians, that Christian people don't necessarily label themselves Christians, but there are quite a number of people that I know that are Jewish. They don't really, probably don't even know anything about, religious teachings, or if you ask them some question, or if you ask them something about the Bible, I couldn't tell you. So how do you get away from anti-Semitism in a non-religious, when you're not talking about that? You're talking as Jewish people sometimes label themselves Jewish, but it has nothing to do with religion. Do you understand?
Right, Judaism is not just a religion. Christianity is a religion, and Judaism is a religion and a people group. And Jews can be discriminated against totally apart from their religious feelings. But there still is probably a religious basis, at least in centuries.
Well, right, but we have to move our minds on the past. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years ago in terms of
One can't forget that. I mean, one can't forget that. Nazism, really rose out of some of those seeds that were planted. And Christians have been very honest about facing that. Skilabeks, for example, radical Catholic theologian, really connects New Testament anti-Semitism and Nazism much more openly than I chose to do today. So one has to see that historical development and work on a very contemporary way.
Could I ask you to keep taking questions? I'm learning as much from the question and answer period as I did from the original presentation.
To follow suggestions, I'm happy to
continue.
Happy to stay.
Let me take this opportunity to say to those students who are looking for syllabuses, Professor Zimmer said they are available in the Hutchins School office. You have them here?
They are here.
Oh, you have them here.
Just put the,
Professor Matt is the author of this book, Zohar, the Book of Enlightenment, and has had exceedingly views. And if anyone is interested, he brought a few copies here, and you have an opportunity to buy it. Now, if you want to continue with questions.
Wait, why don't we say 3 or 4 more? Those of you who have to go, please do, and we'll take a few more questions. Yes?
Comment on what you said about the fact that when the Jews participated in the Russian Revolution, they achieved some importance and some prestige. To close, bring it full circle, of course, this very prominence in the hierarchy of the Bolshevik Revolution caused them a lot of grief later when Goebbels and Hitler combined the two and said Bolshevism means Judaism, and the two are Untermenschen, and let's eradicate them both.
Right, and in America too, that communism and Judaism, communism and socialism and Judaism often identified as right, and certainly within Russia itself.
Stalin himself.
Right, I was going to say within Russia itself, Lenin is obviously much more of an anti-Semite than Lenin, but Lenin's view was that Judaism would gradually disappear and merge into the proletariat, and that still hasn't happened. Any other questions? Yes.
I don't know exactly how to go about this one. You mentioned that Jesus did not want to establish a new religion.
Right, that Jesus did not want to establish a new religion. Jesus was Jewish and was simply teaching his version, you could say, oral Torah. He wasn't a card-carrying Pharisee, but he was certainly closer to the Pharisees than to many of the other Jewish movements at the time. For example, the Sadducees, the people who ran the temple, the priestly class and the temple hierarchy, they are probably the people who were responsible, along with the Roman authorities, for Jesus' death.
And that Judaism then took a split.
Once the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees really had no more power base. The temple was destroyed and the priestly class had very little to do. And at that point, after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, the Pharisees really define what will become rabbinic Judaism. At the same time as the church is in its initial period of growth.
So why did the early church find it necessary to develop a different church, a Christian church? If they could have worked through, did they just not have the patience to stay with it and work to change things?
Well, the central Christian belief, perhaps already lifetime, but certainly afterward, is that this is the Redeemer, this is the Messiah, and he has come. And most Jews refused to accept that. For most Jews, it was unthinkable that the Messiah had arrived and the world had not been radically transformed. So Jews didn't believe the Messiah had came, and this one messianic sect within Judaism did feel that very strongly, and there was friction, and both sides excluding the other, both sides defining the other one out, defining them out of Judaism. Yes?
Just 2 things I wanted to ask you. First of all, there was no Jewish general during that time of the Dreyfus. It was a captain only.
Captain. Right.
Second thing, I wanted to ask you if you could comment on the transition from religious anti-Semitism to racial anti-Semitism. Because there was a departure from being guilty by believing into a religious system and something which was born, genetic, inferior, which had nothing to do with religion anymore, or very little.
Right. Perhaps still with a religious basis, but the horrors of Nazism are much more due to that Aryan, non-Aryan split than to any overtly religious message. I mean, I think Hitler is building on elements of Christian anti-Semitism, but that isn't the platform. That isn't what's being established. So that's true. That's the blessing in the contemporary world. What helped the Jews somewhat in the emancipation was putting things on a secular basis, saying Christianity shouldn't be the criterion by which to admit people into society. But once the religious element was on the back burner, these inimical distinctions took on a racial tone and turned out certainly even more disastrous.
The important thing was that even if they no longer adhere to the Jewish faith, In very many cases, they still were considered to be Jewish, not based on their religion, but by virtue of their race, so-called race.
What was the fraction? 1/16th or one quarter?
I guess. I think an excellent, to continue up on the Dreyfus, on Captain Dreyfus's, which eventually is directly responsible for the creation of Israel. Herzl, and there was a misconception there before, Herzl was pushing for Zionism as a fear, as a measure against assimilation or emancipation. And the truth was that Herzl was as assimilated as possible. He was working for the Neue Freie Presse in Vienna, was a correspondent in Paris, came to see the Dreyfus trial. Dreyfus was as assimilated as Herzl, and yet they were screaming Sans Juif, were screaming for the Jews to get out of France. And then Hitler said, if someone like Dreyfus, who was more French, Herzl said, who was more French than the French who were screaming at him, could not have a homeland in France, then there is no place for the Jews but in an Alt-Neuland.
Right. It wasn't a question of whether Jews should assimilate or not, whether they would possibly be accepted.
Religion aside.
Right, on a social basis in Europe. Obviously, Herzl's vision of Israel was more like Paris than Sharim, but... Yes.
You use the term alien frequently. Where we are right now in our own culture in this country, are we creating alien groups, as an example, of people with disabilities, some 37 million in this country with an unemployment rate of 60%. Are we creating aliens by color of skin, by culture that might not totally mesh with maybe some of our narcissistic attitudes? Are there any similarities between some of the things going on right now in this country with what you've been discussing here?
Sure, I think so. I think, one of the great messages of Wiesel is the fact that he's able to both teach the Holocaust itself and to make connections between the Holocaust and, other troubling issues like that. And from him, you feel that it is authentic. He's not someone who's trying to cover up the Holocaust or dilute it, but he's willing to, speak of other people being persecuted, of other people being treated as Jews, as blacks. We should be sensitive to that. The Jews don't have a monopoly on persecution, but we can hopefully be sensitized by history and promote something better.
I have a handout which somehow charts out the development of an in and out group. So group here, I don't think this is the other side as you see. Which might help you to better understand the alienation process.
That Christ was the Messiah, or that he was the chosen one, so to speak. How do the Jewish people explain Elijah's prophecy of the coming of John the Baptist, who would, in turn, speak before the coming of the new Messiah, or the coming of the Messiah, where he tells us that in X amount of years, at some point, there will come before the Messiah, speaking of the coming of the Messiah. In this case, John the Baptist preaching the Christ.
Right. I don't want to really get into debating, what
Oh, I'm not
debating,
debating,
which
I'm
thing,
curious.
but in a general way, I would say that Jews believe that the Messiah will come, and right, and it may be that Christians believe that the Messiah will return. Jews believe the Messiah will when it may be the same messianic figure, but each of those verses or each of those accounts can be interpreted in various ways. And, even in the church itself, you have disagreement about exactly what. And there's actually some competition between John the Baptist and Jesus. It may be that certain followers of John the Baptist didn't want to accept Jesus himself. But that's really for another lecture. I would just mention one book, if you're interested. There's a very fine book called Jesus the Jew by a New Testament scholar named Vermege, V-E-R-M-E. Very nice attempt to portray Jesus in the context of first century Judaism.
My question really wasn't relating to the Christian aspect, but how the Jewish saw the prophecy of Elijah, that a Christ will come at some point.
Sure.
Or do you look at Muhammad's
No, the Jews would say that as a prediction of the Messiah will come, namely as someone who will take back the throne of David, and that will happen, but has not yet happened. That would be the traditional Jewish interpretation. Yes?
We growth in this country, sort of wildfire growth of the religious right, the Christian fundamentalists, the Baptists, and so on, as a harbinger of a possible anti-Semitic mood in the country?
I guess that danger is there. I mean, there's some positive aspects of the growth of the religious right, for example, support of the State of Israel. But, you know, in terms of affecting education, you know, the identity of the generation of Jews growing up, one has to be sensitive to that. I think the Anti-Defamation League and other groups are looking out for that. Not that we shouldn't, you know, but I'm fairly optimistic, and I don't see real great dangers of anti-Semitism. Obviously, the situation in the Middle East at the moment is enough to concern us, and you know, one has to be. I think Jews too are responsible to be critical of Israel at times for Israel's good and partly for our own good in the West. Maybe let me. This person asked first. I was
going to say, I read the Vatican does not recognize Israel as a state.
Right.
What is the rationale for that?
It probably has to do somewhat with one factor is probably Christian communities in Arab lands and possible persecution of them. And I think there may be some lingering anti-Semitism behind it, as if it's possibly face the fact that Jews really do control their destiny, that these people who rejected Christ can have real political power. Some combination of those two. Yes?
I wanted to ask, I know you're a Kabbalist, or study Kabbalism, and do the Kabbalists concern themselves with anti-Semitism? Do they have any interesting comments or special ideas about it?
It does come up in books of Kabbalah. The main text of Kabbalah, the book Zohar, was written in Spain in the 13th century when things are not yet bad for the Jews, really, but the good times there's already been a peak, really. It's still 200 years before the expulsion, but there is a sense of being surrounded by the others, being surrounded by the unknown, even certain connections between demonic powers and Christianity. But I don't think, I mean, the insights or the beauties of Jewish mysticism, I think, are something to bear and to teach and to spread among Jews and non-Jews. In terms of an analysis of anti-Semitism per se, nothing that I think comes to mind right now as being helpful. More material in the other direction. Yes?
When you were talking about the Middle Ages, you said the church regarded usury as harmful to salvation.
Right.
So the church felt, let the Jews do it because they're doomed anyway.
Right. Since someone had for mercantilism or for...
And then you said something else that I didn't catch, and the next thing I was aware of, you said the Jews, it was all right then to expel the Jews from England. And what was the connection?
Other factors arose to help finance on an international scale. International banking, non-Jewish financial resources started to become available.
And
therefore Jews were less vital, were less necessary. So that may have speeded up expulsion from some places.
Did the church change its thinking on money lending then?
That wasn't followed. I guess absolutely. I was really talking more on a small scale. On a small scale, usury or money lending was frowned upon by the church, but in certain places where the church had less power, it was.
But where in Middle-aged Europe would that be?
It's a good question. I may need to one or two of the historians here to answer that. But the facts I came across were simply that international banking did arise, and Jews were not part of that in many instances, which meant that local sources of Jewish money were less attractive, less necessary. Yes.
Did the Ecumenical Council, which was convened by Pope John, did it help in any way to erase an anti-Semitism by the church? church.
Certainly that was a great step forward there. It's called Vatican II. It's probably its most famous pronouncement was to say that Christians cannot hold Jews collectively responsible, contemporary Jews certainly, collectively responsible for the death of Jesus. And the church to come out and say that was very important. Some elements in the Good Friday liturgy, which had been very dramatically anti-Semitic, were removed. And in general, the fact that the Pope was willing to call Jewish theologians, people like Abraham Joshua Heschel, and speak with him and consult with him and have him contribute. In some ways, the present Pope is more conservative and certainly is drawn back to a certain extent, but things that were set in motion by Vatican II are still helpful, and hopefully there'll be improvement or resurgence.
Well, that was the forerunner to my next question. Was some of the progress by Vatican II, is it in motion or has it gone back to the way it used to be?
I would say, on a small scale, a community scale, certainly in America, things are dramatically different and better than they were 20, 30 years ago. In terms of the church as a body, or Rome's position, there've been ups and downs, and I don't think any pope has been as forceful or as helpful as John Paul. But what we started in motion, I think, can never be turned back in terms of the American scene. Certainly. Yes.
I'd like to know your opinion on how dangerous you think the Order and the American Nazi Party and skinheads, even though they're a small group that do get a lot of press, how dangerous they are to Jews in America today.
These manifestations of anti-Semitism in ears, skinheads or the Order or radical neo-Nazi groups, obviously it's dangerous, and it's no accident that it feeds on times of economic stress and in geographical areas where there have been foreclosures and people out of work. And one has to keep a close eye on that. Obviously, I don't think it's really on a national scale, but obviously there are areas of the country where it is dangerous. And we should premise that, and not only Jews alone, obviously, but to encourage others. I think I'm going to have to call an evening. I have to go back and teach in Berkeley this evening. So,